Having explored the agent as a mere collection of representations in our previous discussion on the eye of the storm, we now pivot towards a more dynamic perspective. We're moving from thinking about the mind as just a bunch of symbols being shuffled around, that's the cognitivist view, to something far more fascinating: emergent properties. It's about how complex things pop up out of simple interactions, like consciousness itself. Now, the idea that the mind is just a fancy computer manipulating symbols has been the dominant story for a while. But even back in the early days of cybernetics, folks were scratching their heads. They looked at actual brains and saw, well, chaos, no neat central processor, no tidy filing cabinets for information. Instead, it's this massive web of connections, constantly changing based on what the organism experiences. Think of it like a social network, but with neurons and synapses. This hinted at something called self-organization. The system organizes itself. Early pioneers like Rosenblatt with his perceptron, a surprisingly simple machine learning device, and Ashby, who studied huge networks of random connections showing surprisingly coherent behavior, were onto something big. They showed you could get organized behavior without a central boss calling the shots. But here's the twist: these revolutionary ideas got sidelined. The computationalist view, the brain as a von Neumann computer, took over. For about 25 years, it was the official doctrine. Dennett even called it the High Church of Computationalism. Then, boom, around the late 70s, connectionism made a comeback, bigger and better than ever. Why? Well, partly because similar ideas were popping up elsewhere in physics and math, and suddenly computers were fast enough to actually simulate these complex networks. More importantly, people started realizing the old way had some serious flaws. First, the von Neumann bottleneck. Processing things one step at a time just doesn't cut it for tasks needing massive parallel processing, like recognizing faces in a crowd or predicting the weather. The orthodox view wasn't really looking for parallel solutions. Second, symbolic systems are fragile. Break one part, and the whole thing can crash. But the brain, it's remarkably robust. Damage one area and other areas often compensate. Distributed systems offer a kind of resilience that sequential, localized systems lack. And here's another nail in the coffin for the traditional cognitivist approach. They kind of got the scale backwards. Initially, they aimed for artificial general intelligence, trying to build machines that could solve any problem like a human expert. But as they hit roadblocks, they scaled down to simpler, more specific tasks. And in doing so, they missed a crucial point. The real magic of intelligence might lie not in high-level reasoning, but in the fundamental ability to learn from scratch, like a baby acquiring language or making sense of the world from raw sensory input. Even tiny insects do amazing things incredibly quickly, things that would take ages for a computer, following rigid pre-programmed rules. The cognitivist models just weren't capturing the biological reality, especially aspects like the brain's amazing plasticity and its ability to adapt after injury, which are just assumed in living creatures but weren't even on the radar of the computational paradigm. So, what's the alternative strategy? Connectionism brings the brain back into focus, but not as a literal computer but as inspiration. The idea is to build cognitive models not from abstract symbols, but from a swarm of simple components. Think artificial neurons. You connect them up and then magic happens. Interesting global properties emerge, properties that represent the cognitive skills we want to model. How does this happen? Through learning. The most famous rule is Hebb's rule: cells that fire together wire together. Basically, if two neurons tend to activate simultaneously, the connection between them gets stronger. If they don't, it weakens. Over time, the network structure literally encodes its history and the tasks it learns. Because the action is all in the connections and their dynamics, this approach is called connectionism. It's about the network's collective behavior, not just individual symbol manipulation. Now, why did connectionism really explode in popularity recently? A huge factor was the development of mathematical tools to actually track what's going on inside these complex networks. Before, it was like trying to understand a city by only looking at individual houses. Suddenly, researchers developed statistical measures that gave the entire network an energy function. Think of it like a landscape where the system naturally rolls downhill towards stable states, or attractors. This energy landscape concept, largely thanks to John Hopfield, allowed scientists to mathematically analyze how these networks converge, how they settle down, and how they perform computations. It provided a rigorous framework to study these emergent phenomena. Let's look at a concrete example. Imagine you have a bunch of simple processing units, like little neurons. You feed them a sequence of patterns, maybe representing images hitting the retina. After seeing each pattern, you let the network tweak its connections using a learning rule, like Hebs. This is the learning phase. Once the learning is done, you show the network one of the patterns it learned. What happens? It recognizes it. The network settles into a unique internal state that corresponds to that specific pattern. And get this. It works even if the input pattern is noisy, or if some of the network units are damaged. As long as the number of patterns isn't too large compared to the number of units, roughly 15%, the system can reliably recognize what it's seen before, even with imperfections. This robustness is a hallmark of connectionist models. This example highlights the core idea again. Build a system from simple parts connected dynamically. Each part only knows its immediate neighbors and follows simple local rules. There's no grand central controller dictating everything. Yet somehow cooperation emerges across the entire network, leading to a globally coherent state. This transition from local interactions to global order is what the cybernetic folks called self-organization. Today, we use terms like emergent properties, complex systems, network dynamics, or even synergy to describe this phenomenon. It's about how the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts, arising spontaneously from the interactions. And this isn't just some niche phenomenon confined to neuroscience. Emergent properties are everywhere. From swirling vortices in fluids and the coherent light of lasers, to chemical reactions that oscillate rhythmically, to genetic networks controlling development, immune systems fighting off invaders, ecosystems balancing populations, even geological processes. The common thread? In all these diverse systems, complex, coordinated behaviors or properties emerge from the interactions within a network of simpler elements. Researchers are trying to understand the general principles behind this emergence. One powerful tool for understanding this across different fields is the concept of an attractor in dynamical systems theory. Let's peek at that next. To illustrate attractors, let's consider a classic example: cellular automata. Imagine a row of cells, each very simple, maybe just on or off. Each cell looks at its immediate neighbors and updates its own state based on a simple rule, like if my left neighbor is on and my right neighbor is off, then I turn on. You define these rules for each cell, and you connect them in a loop, so the last cell wraps around to the first. Figure 5.1 shows this setup. It's incredibly minimal, just a ring of basic units following local rules. No complex machinery here, just simple components interacting. Now, what happens when you start this simple system? You give it a random starting pattern, and then let the rules run. At each step in time, every cell updates its state simultaneously. Figure 5.2 shows what this looks like visually. Each row represents the state of the entire system at one moment in time. If you follow a single column down, you see the history of one particular cell. What's fascinating is that even with such a ridiculously simple setup, complex patterns can emerge. The system doesn't just stay random, it tends to evolve into certain recurring configurations. Stephen Wolfram famously studied these cellular automata extensively. He found that depending on the specific rules you choose, the system falls into one of four main types of behavior, or attractors. First, you might get a simple attractor, where everything just turns on, or everything turns off. Second, you can get periodic spatial patterns, like stripes or checkerboards that repeat. Third, there are space-time cycles, more complex repeating patterns involving both space and time. And finally, for some rules, the system becomes chaotic, producing seemingly random, unpredictable patterns. The key takeaway here is that this kind of self-organization, this emergence of global patterns from local rules, isn't some rare trick of neural networks. It seems to be a fundamental property of any sufficiently interconnected system. This broad applicability makes the study of emergent properties highly relevant. So, why the current excitement around connectionism? Well, it offers elegant explanations for a range of cognitive phenomena. Think about how we instantly recognize faces, how memories seem linked together, or how we categorize new objects. Connectionist models provide functional accounts for these abilities. Plus, there are several reasons for the renewed enthusiasm. Firstly, they offered compelling explanations for cognition that classical AI and neuroscience struggled with at the time. Secondly, they felt biologically plausible, bridging the gap between artificial intelligence and neuroscience in ways previously unimaginable. Thirdly, they nudge psychology back towards a more behavioral focus, focusing on observable patterns rather than purely internal, high-level mental states, though cognitivism had legitimized talking about those. And finally, these models are remarkably general, adaptable to different domains like vision or language with relatively few tweaks. Now, remember our simple cellular automaton. It showed emergent patterns, but it didn't really learn in the way we usually think of learning. Many basic reflexes or movements, like saccadic eye movements, involve such emergent neural states without needing explicit training. But most of the complex cognition we care about does require learning from experience. That's where learning rules come in. Rules like Hebs allow the network to adjust its connections based on what it encounters, effectively encoding experience into its structure. Broadly speaking, there are two main flavors of learning explored in neural networks. One is correlation-based learning, like Hebs' rule, where the network learns associations by strengthening connections between co-activated units. The other is imitation-based learning, famously implemented by backpropagation. Here, the network tries to minimize the difference between its output and a desired output, kind of like a student trying to mimic their teacher's answers. Adjustments are made throughout the hidden layers to achieve this goal. Okay, so connectionism is cool, but does it actually reflect how the brain works? Increasingly, yes. Recent research provides strong evidence that these emergent principles are fundamental to brain function. In fact, understanding the brain's distributed, global properties has been a holy grail of neuroscience since the days of Sherrington and Pavlov. But getting there has been tough. Technically, it's hard to record from thousands of neurons scattered across the brain simultaneously. Conceptually, for a long time, neuroscientists were stuck thinking about the brain using the language of information processing, the computer metaphor. This limited their perspective. For instance, while visual cortex neurons do respond to specific features, like edges or orientations, these responses are often seen in simplified preparations. In a real, awake animal navigating the world, these responses become incredibly context-dependent. Tilt the head, play a sound, and the neuron's response changes dramatically. Its activity isn't isolated, it's influenced by signals coming from all over the brain. This leads neuroscientists to realize they need to study neurons not in isolation, but as members of constantly shifting groups interacting cooperatively. There's even a rule for thumb in brain anatomy. If region A connects to region B, B usually connects back to A. This pervasive reciprocity means the brain is fundamentally a cooperative system. Cooperation happens locally within brain regions and globally between them. The entire brain achieves a kind of internal coherence through these intricate interactions, even if we can't fully map every detail. Take the reticular activating system, for example. Stimulation there can switch an animal from sleep to wakefulness. But does that mean it controls wakefulness? Not really. It's necessary for wakefulness, but it's not sufficient. The actual state of being awake or asleep emerges from the coordinated activity of the whole brain network. These neural emergences happen at many levels, from individual cells to large brain regions, each requiring different tools to study. Let's look at a specific example, the very beginning of visual processing. Textbooks often depict a simple pathway, eye to thalamus to visual cortex. Information flows sequentially, but look closer at the actual wiring as shown in Figure 5.3b. The lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN, that relay station in the thalamus, is heavily embedded in a web of connections. Crucially, 80% of the input to an LGN cell comes not from the retina, but from other parts of the brain. And there are more fibers running downwards from the visual cortex to the LGN than upwards. So calling this a simple sequential chain feels pretty arbitrary. Instead, what happens is that incoming visual information meets with activity flowing down from the cortex right at the LGN level. This interaction, this meeting of sensory input and cortical expectations or internal state, is a crucial step in forming a coherent percept. And the LGN isn't just talking to the cortex, it's also interacting with other structures like the superior colliculus and oculomotor nuclei. It's less like a rigid command chain and more like a bustling hub of communication, a lively party where everyone's chatting and influencing each other. Models like art try to capture this complexity mathematically. Figure 5.4 shows the basic architecture. It's inspired by the visual pathway with two main stages, F1 and F2, representing the LGN and visual cortex. The core idea is resonance. A pattern coming in from the bottom STM activates a matching pattern stored at the top LTM. This creates a resonant state. If the top-down match isn't good, attention mechanisms kick in to adjust the system until a match is found or a new category is formed. What's neat about art is that it can self-organize, stabilize, and learn categories rapidly, even without being told beforehand what the categories are. It's all about describing the emergent properties of these parallel, interacting networks. Now, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier. The Buddhist concept of the five skandhas, or aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, consciousness. We asked whether these arise sequentially or simultaneously. Traditionally, the skandhas aren't presented as a computational theory. They're more like a phenomenological description of the experience of self. But let's entertain the question from a cognitive science perspective. If we take a sequential view, say, form processing happens first in the retina, then sensation in the thalamus, and so on, it feels like we're imposing a computational sequence onto brain activity. But perception isn't that simple or direct. Our interpretation is always colored by prior knowledge and expectations. If we borrow the connectionist idea of emergent configurations, perhaps the skandhas represent resonance states that emerge at a given moment. These states aren't instantaneous. They take time to stabilize through cycles of interaction across different brain regions. Meditation practices, particularly those focused on open awareness, seem to validate this idea of experiencing moments of coherent emergence, lending credence to the notion that these transient configurations feel solid, precisely because they are emergent properties of the system. So, we've talked a lot about connectionism, emergence, self-organization. This is a young and diverse field, with many different takes. But let's try to answer those fundamental questions about cognition that the cognitivist approach tackled. What is cognition? In this view, it's the emergence of global states in a network of simple components. How does it work? Through local rules governing individual units and rules for changing the connections between them. And how do we know if a cognitive system works? When its emergent properties solve a specific task. Notice something missing? Symbols, in the traditional sense, play no role here. Symbolic computation is replaced by numerical operations, like the equations describing the network's dynamics. Meaning isn't found in discrete symbols, but in the complex patterns of activity across the entire network. This shift away from symbols is radical. Cognitivism relied on symbols to bridge the gap between physical computation and semantics. Symbols were both the physical tokens and the meaning bearers. The computer manipulates the form, while we provide the meaning externally. But this creates a problem. How do the symbols get their meaning in the first place? It's easy if you have a predefined set of stimuli and responses. But if you remove those constraints, the symbols are just meaningless bits, like data without a program. Connectionism sidesteps this by saying meaning isn't in the symbols themselves, but in the global state of the network and how that state relates to the system's overall performance, like recognizing an object or learning a task. Because this global state emerges from a dense network, some call this the subsymbolic paradigm. It suggests the fundamental principles of cognition lie beneath the level of discrete symbols, closer to biology, yet potentially more general than symbolic systems. Meaning arises from the interactions, not from the individual components. Okay, so we have this subsymbolic world of emergence and this symbolic world of computation. How do they relate? Some say they are separate approaches, or maybe you just pragmatically mix them, using connectionism for low-level stuff and symbols for high-level stuff. But the authors propose a more interesting relationship: inclusion. Think of symbols as a higher-level description, a useful shorthand, for properties that are ultimately embedded in a deeper, distributed system. The classic example is the genetic code. DNA triplets code for amino acids, but only because they operate within the complex metabolic machinery of the cell. We can abstract away that background and talk about codes, but the code only makes sense in context. Similarly, symbolic descriptions in cognition might be legitimate, but they are ultimately descriptions of patterns that emerge from the underlying neural network. This idea of symbols emerging from a deeper substrate isn't just theoretical. Researchers like Paul Smolensky have developed explicit theories along these lines. His harmony theory, for instance, uses distributed representations and statistical algorithms to model intuitive reasoning. The system performs inference, which could be described symbolically, but the actual performance happens at a sub-symbolic level without needing a symbolic interpreter. The difference from the cognitivist view is subtle but important. Both agree we need descriptive categories. Cognitivism says those categories are symbols. The inclusive view says symbols are just convenient approximations for processes governed by subsymbolic principles. This has big implications. It helps clarify where meaning comes from, it's tied to the emergent properties of the system. And it suggests that any symbolic level we use to describe cognition is inherently dependent on the underlying network's structure and history. Purely procedural descriptions detached from this history might be incomplete. Now, the cognitivist might push back. Okay, maybe this inclusion thing works for basic stuff like genetics, but for complex things like language, deduction, or recursive structures, we absolutely need an independent, precise symbolic level. That's the only way to capture systematicity and productivity. Fair point, but the counter-argument is that this definition of cognition is too narrow. Look at the immune system. It exhibits sophisticated, adaptive behavior that's clearly cognitive in some sense, but it doesn't rely on symbolic manipulation in the way language does. By broadening our view of cognition to include such diverse systems, we can see symbolic computation as just one specialized type of cognitive process, perhaps highly autonomous, but still embedded in a larger system. The emergentist approach, by contrast, is open to this wider variety. A mixed or inclusive strategy seems the most natural path forward. And looking ahead, the combination of less rigid cognitivism and emergentism, especially in practical fields like AI, seems poised to yield significant results for years to come. These are deep questions, and there's no final answer yet. The future research will tell us more. But the key takeaway here is that the concept of emergence provides a powerful lens through which to view the dialogue between modern cognitive science and the rich introspective experience explored in traditions like mindfulness and open awareness meditation. It suggests a way to understand consciousness and cognition that goes beyond simple symbol pushing. With that, we've laid the groundwork for exploring how this perspective connects directly to experiential inquiry.